You spoke about the dollar and oil, right? And one of the people who paid for their lives was Muammar Gaddafi. So, what role does money play in shaping world history, and how can African countries get out of the debt trap that has been set by Western financiers? Because if you recall, I mean, in 1987 at the OAU, Organization for African Unity, Thomas Sankara gave a speech whereby he was declaring that Africans should not pay debt, which later paid with his life. And he told them that if they don't unite with him in saying no to the Western debts, then he's not gonna be back for the next meeting, which of course he wasn't back.
Well, that's a big question. I think ultimately what's going to have to happen is what happened when Rhodesia became Zimbabwe. That is to say, there were talks in London at Lancaster House with all of the stakeholders involved. And the talks took a very long time before an agreement was reached that led to a new dispensation. I think that with regard to debt, there's going to have to be something similar. And what may have to happen is that the debt holders, including institutions in the North Atlantic countries, as they say on Wall Street in the United States, they're going to have to take a haircut. That is to say, they're going to have to take a loss because the debt is unsustainable. You have countries that a significant percentage of their budget goes to paying debt holders, for example, which means there's less money for education and healthcare and the people's needs. But obviously, when you talk about these powerful institutions taking a haircut, that is to say, taking a loss, they're not going to accept that willingly. So what that means is that it's going to be a process. I think what you should expect to unfold in coming years is a strengthening of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. As suggested, Egypt may be joining the BRICS, Argentina, Turkey, perhaps Indonesia. And so you're going to have an alternative bloc to confront the North Atlantic countries, who are the major holders of African debt, for example. And they're going to have to force an agreement on the North Atlantic countries to accept pennies on the dollar with regard to these debts. And it's going to lead to increased tension, I'm afraid, between African countries and the BRICS on the one hand, and the North Atlantic countries on the other. And so African countries should begin to prepare for this tension by engaging in political education of the masses of their citizenry. I think I mentioned last time about how in socialist countries, the level of organization, it starts with the young pioneers, where you have children from 9 to 18 in an organization. And then you have a youth wing of a dominant political party, people from 18 to 40. And then you have a dominant political party, generally led by adults and senior citizens. And that's the model in Cuba. And as a matter of fact, I would suggest that African leaders study the history of Cuba in order to get an idea as to how to withstand destabilization, because Cuba is 90 miles from Florida. A socialist revolution taking place 90 miles from Florida. And it's been able to withstand overthrow. In fact, there's a documentary, you may be able to find it online. I think the title is something like 744 Ways to Kill Fidel Castro. Apparently, there were 744 attempts to murder Fidel Castro, the leader and president of Cuba, who died a few years ago at the age of about 90. So obviously, those and the Cubans, as you probably know, have developed very sophisticated security measures. In fact, whenever there is a left-wing government in the Americas that arises, like in Venezuela under Maduro, they always call on the Cubans to provide security, for example. And security not only means the physical protection of the leadership, it means uncovering CIA plots, because nobody knows you like your neighbors, for example. And the Cubans are neighbors of the United States, and they know, matter of fact, the Cubans oftentimes infiltrate US intelligence. There was this woman who just got released from prison, who was a leading US intelligence official supposedly monitoring Cuba, but she was actually working for the Cubans, telling the Cubans what the United States was trying to do. So for any African country, I would say you should increase relations with Cuba. You should have an embassy in Havana. You should make sure that there is a Cuban embassy in your country. You should work out a deal whereby Cuba sends doctors and technicians to your country. And also, not least, that you consult with the Cubans about security in order to foil these plots that, of course, led to the death of Patrice Lumumba, Muammar Gaddafi et al.
And Sankara too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but how do they do it? The Cubans, in terms of...
Once again, you could do worse than to start with my book on Cuba. Now, my book on Cuba deals with the relations up into the revolution, up to 1959. However, there is a small library of literature on the Cuban Revolution. In fact, in my book on Southern Africa, White Supremacy Confronted, the Cubans play a major role in that book because, as you probably know, the key to the liberation of Southern Africa comes with the deployment of the Cuban military in Southern Angola in the 1970s, 1980s, defeating the apartheid military on the battlefield. That's the turning point for Nelson Mandela being elected. In fact, at his inauguration, President Castro gets the wildest and stormiest applause, because any South African child can tell you that the Cuban military victory was the key. And what's really beautiful about that is that a number of leaders of the Cuban military are of African descent. And so you have the descendants of enslaved Africans returning to the continent to defeat the racists. I mean, I can't think of anything more beautiful than that. And once again, if there is one point that is extracted from this conversation, it is that all African nations should tighten relations with Havana immediately, if not sooner.